Hello and welcome everyone to the first segment in the history of French Valley. I'm David Johnson, and in this segment, we're going to be going over the period between 1850 to 1900 and what caused those settlers to actually move from France here to the United States, the type of situations they were facing in Europe at the time, and the type of situations they were facing here in the United States during that time. And we're going to finish off looking at a few of the photos of the early settlers once they really found their roots here in this region. Now, we're going to start off here in France of 1850, and these are the three things we're going to be looking at: the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and the impact it had on our settlers, an idea known as powder keg Europe, and the social and political unrest that unwound in Europe following the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and during the buildup of the powder keg in Europe. Now, one of the first things that you need to understand about the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 are the main players. On your left, you'll see Kaiser Wilhelm I, who was the newly crowned emperor under the unified German states. It was a collaboration of independent German states before, and under the Kaiser, they attempted to bring all the states under one unified rule. And on the right-hand side is Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who is the military and political leader during the time. And the two worked hand in hand in trying to realize this dream of one major unified German state. Now, in the center of your screen, you'll see something known as the Dreiße needle rifle. And we're going to take a look at the French one next, but these types of needle rifles made warfare very different than it had been before. It certainly changed it from being Napoleonic warfare, where you would have a rank and file group standing in line firing black powder muskets at one another, to now you can have individual squads all armed with single shot rifles such as this one, and they're all able to move in concert with one another and able to be much more effective on the battlefield. This would revolutionize warfare and bring about an idea known as total war. That idea would come to complete fruition all the way down in the Second World War. So at this point, it was still very new. They were still experimenting with a lot of tactics. And the Germans actually during the War of 1870 were some of the main agitators of these new tactics. Unlike the French, the Germans did employ those squads. They would employ a flanking maneuver if they could. They would employ pincer maneuvers. They were trying to mobilize their army in ways that were not being tried before. The Dreiße needle rifle is a very good example of what the impact that the Industrial Revolution had on warfare during the time, because it was very, very profound. And now we come to the French. And the three people that you see on the screen now would have been very familiar to the early settlers of French Valley. These would be the people who would be in charge of the French Empire when they left the country. On the left-hand side, you have Napoleon III, who would be the French emperor. And on the right, you have the two military leaders, Patrice de MacMahon and Francois Achille Bazin. Above the two generals, you see the Chassepot needle rifle with its very large bayonet there. That is the French variant of the Dreiße needle rifle. It, again, could fire multiple rounds very quickly. It was a single-shot rifle, but reloading was very, very much quicker than trying to reload a muzzle-loading musket. And the French didn't take as much of an advantage with that rifle as the Germans did. The French still believed in Napoleonic-style warfare with cannons, artillery, and rank-and-file soldiers all firing in a volley toward the enemy. Now, as we're going to see later on, that is really going to be one of the main factors in deciding who would win this war and who would go on to lose this war. And now we come to what's known as the Eve of Destruction. The man you see before you is Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, and his part in the Franco-Prussian War was that he was actually elected, or at least sponsored, by Kaiser Wilhelm I to be the King of Spain. Now, it's very clear that Prince Leopold did definitely hold the pedigree to hold the title as the King of Spain, but to the French, they saw this as absolute destruction of the French Empire. The French would look at this as the continued encirclement of their empire, with Kaiser Wilhelm I and Otto von Bismarck already taking all but 4 of the independent German states under their rule, with the addition of Spain now coming on the side of the Germans. France would be virtually surrounded. And with the military might that all of these nations combined could draw against France, there was no way that they were going to be able to fight them all off. And so after the advocacy of Kaiser Wilhelm I, representing Prince Leopold to this throne, the French emperor, Emperor Napoleon III, actually began a discourse with him that turned sour very, very quickly. And it became really known that all of the things that had been happening in the 1850s, 1860s, and now all the way up to this 1870 were now coming to fruition in an all-out war. It was something that both sides did try to stop, but it was something that both sides could not stop in the very end. It was very clear that both sides believed that they would win the war. Both sides believed that they had every right to fight for their rights before the war. And now it was really the election, or the supposed endorsement of the Kaiser, of this prince to the throne of Spain, that really set off a lot of fireworks in France and in Germany. And to that point, the Germans actually saw the way the wind was blowing and mobilized before the French even adopted a formal declaration of war. Bismarck and the Kaiser began mobilizing the German armed forces on the night of July 15th and began moving them toward the border between France and Germany. France, in turn, adopted a formal declaration of war and began mobilizing its own army groups on July 19th. Now, given the time between when the Germans mobilized and when the French mobilized, it's often thought that the Germans were in a better position to defend the areas that they would have to defend, and they were in a much better position to attack the areas that they were planning on attacking. Now, what you're seeing on your screen now is the remnants of the city of Strasbourg, which is in the Alsace-Lorraine region of France, and it's one of the first regions that the Germans actually invaded and crushed the French army. Strasbourg is one of the cities that most of the French Valley settlers would come from following the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. You can see here the level of destruction that's found in the city. Noticeably, you'll see that all of the buildings, whether brick or wood, have been touched at least somewhat by the constant bombardment and constant shelling of the city. And you'll see in the center and off to the right-hand side as well, a German soldier in a pickle helmet with a Dreise needle rifle. Now, likewise, the Battle of Metz happened at roughly the same time, if not a little bit after the siege of Strasbourg was beginning. And Metz is a very telling battle in that the French were trying to fight, again, a Napoleonic-style war, while the Germans were not. They were fighting a much more modern war. Because of this, the French were basically in their stations when the Germans attacked. They were not moving. They were not attempting to thwart any enemy advances or stop them from flanking. And this allowed the Germans to come around the side and take the siege and take the fortress basically in a very, very short amount of time. Now, while all this was happening, you had the Paris Commune of 1871, which was essentially a coup against the French government. And the reason why this coup happened was because there was growing anti-monarchy sentiment all throughout France, all throughout the 1850s, 60s, and now in 1870. This had all come to a head when the French army, which has been touted as going to win the war, they were going to be doing great, is now failing and losing many of these early battles. Most people felt that they had lost confidence in their emperor, they had lost confidence in their country, and they wanted to change. And so the Paris Commune of 1871 happened, and Paris was under siege, which you can see here. These are the streets of Paris during or immediately after the Paris Commune of 1871. And again, this is before the Germans had even entered the city, which is staggering to see that level of destruction, even before the opposing army had entered the capital. Now, you would be forgiven for seeing this picture and thinking that these were the French soldiers that were deployed from the front lines to come back to Paris, to take Paris back from the rioters, from the coup, from the protesters. But in fact, it's the opposite. These are members of the Paris Commune in 1871. These are the people who would take Paris from the government, who would try to take Paris from the government. You can see that they are military soldiers still wearing their military uniforms and equipped with those Chassepot needle rifles that you saw earlier. Now, all of this came to a head in the Battle of Sedan, which was happening roughly concurrently with the Paris Commune of 71. The Battle of Sedan was, again, another failure on the French part. The French lost the Battle of Sedan quite splendidly, quite fabulously. Except for this time, Emperor Napoleon III decided that it was time for him to go into battle himself, to lead his troops from the front and to attempt to win back some of that sentiment that was being lost all throughout France at the time. Now, of course, the French lost the Battle of Sedan, and Emperor Napoleon III wound up in the hands of Otto von Bismarck, which you can see on the left-hand side of your screen down there. The capture of Napoleon III basically cemented the way the war was going to go for everybody, for the Germans, for the French, for all of Europe. They saw this as the final straw. And of course, it was. Eventually, the Germans did make it to France. They did make it to Paris, I'm sorry. They sieged Paris, and they were able to take Paris. The upper right-hand corner of your screen will show art depicting Chancellor Otto von Bismarck bestowing the victory upon Kaiser Wilhelm I in the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles. To the left-hand side, you see what was left of Paris after the Germans came through. Again, remember, some of this destruction might have been caused in the Paris Commune. Some of it was caused by the Germans. It's very hard to tell because the city was destroyed twice in a very short time span. And in the bottom right-hand side of your screen, you're going to see a map of exactly where the Germans took and what was annexed by Prussia and what was annexed by the German Empire and what part was actually lost by France. So in that map, you can see the Alsace-Lorraine region, which is in the darkest of colors of orange there. That was the region that was taken by Germany after the war. That was part of the final victory arrangements, if you will. Now, our French Valley settlers actually hailed from that region. And there's a very good point to that. Most of them, if they still had property and if they still had their lives following the War of 1870, would now be in this. They would be in powder keg Europe. They would be in a Europe that was quickly mobilizing, quickly militarizing. The Industrial Revolution was having a profound impact on military arms and armament. And a lot of them were seeing what was coming. They were seeing that there was a massive buildup, a massive military might. There was nationalism was everywhere, France and Germany and Russia, in the Balkans, everywhere. Now, none of them probably would realize that this boiling pot of trouble, as you see on the right-hand side of your screen, would eventually come to fruition as the First World War. But many of them, whoops, a little bit ahead of ourselves, many of them would come to see the social and political strife that was happening during the time. They would see that if you were not a member of the popular clique or the popular political party, you were preyed upon, you were beaten, you were degraded. And many of them felt that this was the last straw. They had to leave. Their country was in ruins. Their government was in tatters. The Germans had won. There were massive military buildups happening all over Europe. There were border skirmishes breaking out. And the French really knew that they had to leave. They had to get out, and they had to find a better place to call home. And so they did. They went to the United States. And why the United States? A lot of historians point to the fact that the United States and France have had a very close relationship ever since the American War of Independence. That might have been a reason. The other reason might have been that everywhere else in Europe was still an absolute mess, and it was still a giant military buildup. There were still the same problems that they were facing in their home country. And the United States, while facing its own problems itself, might have looked like a more enticing opportunity to them. Now, when the French finally made it to the United States, this was the country that they were coming into. The American Civil War happened before the Franco-Prussian War, but it is worth a mention because the American Civil War was such a defining moment in American history and would definitely define all of the time that going forward. The time that the French settlers would actually be arriving and the time that they would be moving westward across the United States and having to deal with all of the repercussions from the American Civil War is known as the Reconstruction era. These were the scenes that many of the French settlers would have found. This is Atlanta, Georgia, 1864, Richmond, Virginia in 1865. If you'll think back to the picture of the Siege of Strasbourg, the Battle of Metz, you'll notice that the pictures are not too entirely different from each other. For the French coming over, it would have been very disheartening to see that the country that you had left and the country that you were coming into looked very much the same. They had both been fighting a war. The only difference is that the Americans had been fighting themselves. They were fighting secessionists and not a foreign power. You see here is a picture that was taken during the Reconstruction sometime during 1867. These are members of the Ku Klux Klan, which is one of many various organizations that were formed after the fall of the Confederacy to take some type of revenge upon the Union and of the victors, and you can see them here attacking Union soldiers. They also deal with the birth of Jim Crow. And Jim Crow, again, did not necessarily directly affect the French immigrants, but it did actually affect what they saw in America, American values. And it, even though it did focus on African Americans mostly, it did also create a nationalistic pride that did prey upon foreigners as well. But all of that was just pushing them. It was pushing them from east to west. It was a reason for them to say, we're here in the United States, and even though things may not be the best here, there are other parts of this country where things are good. Which now brings us to the talk of westward expansion, manifest destiny, and how they actually came to California. Now, these are some of the people who came west with them, and some of them you might recognize their names. You have Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, Henry McCarty, and John Wesley Hardin, all of them notorious outlaws, and all of them racing westward. Some people came west for the reasons that some of these men did. It was lawless. It was mostly bad lands. It was mostly unregulated. A man could make a living doing nefarious deeds and not really being held accountable for those deeds. So it was dangerous. Now, like the four members that you saw on the previous screen, a lot of the French colonists came by way of wagon, which you can see here. This is an example of one of the many wagons that they would choose from for putting all of their belongings in, not that they would have very many from their Atlantic crossing till now. And they would use these wagons to come westward, usually aiming for Central or Northern California if they were going to come westward, not necessarily Southern California, because the Mexican-American War was still a recent memory and there was still a lot of turmoil in this area in Southern California. However, many of them still chose this mode of transportation to go west. However, if you had the money, and if you had the means, you could take this, the Transcontinental Railroad. This is a famous meeting here in Utah on May 10th, 1869, when the westward bound train met the eastward bound train and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Another example of a railroad, this picture is taken somewhere along the Truckee Pass in Northern California. You can see here an example of other immigrants that were coming west at the time, except they were not coming from east to west. They were coming from west to east from their homeland in China and coming here to the United States. And they, of course, played a pivotal role in the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad and the entire railroad network across not just California, but the United States. And again, we come to the American social ideology, and this is a lot of the same ideology that they were leaving in France. Again, if you were not part of the popular group, so to say, if you were not a nativist, if you were not a nationalist, you would be picked on. And seen here in some of these political cartoons, you can see the low amount of immigrants that were being let in during the time, and you also see in the center bottom of your screen, you're going to see a depiction of an Irish and a German immigrant who is effectively stealing a ballot box. That is a commonly held belief during the time, is that if an election did not go the way you wanted it to be, it must be from an outside source. And they were able to punish and prosecute these newly found Americans, these immigrants, to various extents. And you can also see on the center and on the right-hand side, the no Irish need apply. Again, that's replying to the Irish, not necessarily the French, but it does serve as an example of the growing anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States during the Reconstruction era. Now, once they made it to California, one of the very first peoples who they actually had contact with would have been the American Indians. Now, for our region, we're talking almost exclusively about the Temecula Band of Luiseño Mission Indians. And while they did not have a lot of contact with the Native Americans themselves, it's worth bearing in mind that these are people who were going through their own hard times during this era. They obviously went through the mission period, where the missionaries came up from the Spanish that were conquering Mexico at the time. They came north, they established missions, this one being San Luis Rey in Oceanside, California, which is where most of the Luiseño Indians would go to or were taken to. You have the Mexican-American War, which we previously mentioned, and the Temecula Massacre, which was a result of one of the battles of the Mexican-American War. And of course, you have the events such as the California statehood, the Temecula eviction, and the Treaty of Temecula, all of which are very important pieces of history in the Luiseño people's history. And they were all very deafening blows to their population and to their land. The Treaty of Temecula basically stripped them of the rights to own their own land, the Temecula eviction, kicked them off of whatever land they did own, and sent them into the hills. Basically, the government said that we don't care where you go as long as you don't stay here. Now, of course, as time went on, they were able to reclaim some of their tribal land. They were able to establish their ancestral grounds once again. But again, it's a very poor stain on American history. Now we get to Lewis Wolf, Juan Marietta, and the Temecula. Now, Lewis Wolf and Juan Marietta would be two names that the French Valley immigrants would not immediately be familiar with, though they might be familiar with Lewis Wolf somewhat more than Juan Marietta. Lewis Wolf was, like them, a French immigrant, except he didn't come to America after the Franco-Prussian War. He came during the California Gold Rush. Wolf's intention was to come to California and become a gold miner, strike it rich, and make tons of money. But when he got here, he quickly saw that it was not the gold miners who was getting rich. It was the people who supplied them. So Wolf set about supplying the gold miners. He owned many shops during the time, some in San Francisco, and he eventually moved south all the way to Temecula, where he established a store in the mid-1860s. Wolf ran the store for a number of years with his wife, Ramona Wolf, who he married here in the Valley, and he would have definitely been a point of contact for many of the French immigrants that were coming over to this area. Now, by the time they got here, Wolf would have been a little bit older than he is seen in the picture here in the lower left-hand corner, but to come to this region and to see somebody who is prospering, who is successful, who has their own business, and is a Frenchman, such as themselves, it would have definitely put them somewhat at ease. Now, somebody else who they might have been familiar with was Juan Marietta. There was a railroad that ran through Marietta, Temecula, and there was a railroad that ran through Winchester as well. And that was really one of the reasons why they picked this area to settle. Because of course you can grow crops, you can sustain yourself, but at the end of the day, to make money, you need to be able to get those crops put to market. And the only way to do that was via the railroad. So Juan Marietta, while he never lived in the town of Marietta himself, but it is named after him, obviously, he served as a crucial benefactor for the creation of the Marietta Station that you see in the bottom left-hand corner. And that led to a lot of interaction between the French Valley citizens, the French Valley immigrants, and people in Marietta, and as I said, neighboring Winchester, because that was really the place they brought their grain to lead. They brought their grain to travel all over the United States, and they were able to make a lot of money doing it. Now, this is the part where we're going to take a look at some of the pictures that we've received from the French Valley Historical Society. Now, while not all of the pictures have been named before, there are a few that are well known to us, such as this picture of the Hyatt Schoolhouse and the Alamo Schoolhouse. The Alamo Schoolhouse actually still stands. It's on the bank of Lake Skinner now, and anybody can go and visit it. And it's a wonderful bit of history that has withstood the test of time, and it's been refurbished, and it is just wonderful that they were able to save something from this time period, from this area, with such great historical significance. Now, likewise, some of these photos are unnamed. We're not sure exactly where they are or who is in them, but they're examples of the farming that was taking place in the area. After all, most of the people who came to French Valley were farmers. This is how they were going to support themselves and their families. Likewise, they had to build houses. All of the pictures seen here are examples of houses either in French Valley or in neighboring Winchester, which is where a lot of the French immigrants went to if they did not settle in French Valley. And of course, they had families. Most of the families were born here in the United States. Some of them had come over. You see in the center of your screen the Auld family. Their story is somewhat different than the one that's been recounted in this presentation. They actually came through Canada, moving southward through the western United States, and then finally settling here in French Valley. The other families here are not identified, but they are known to be here in the French Valley region. Now, some names that you all might be familiar with. On the left-hand side, you have William H. Auld. In the right-hand picture, you have Alexander G. Burrell and Pierre Poroy. These are examples of three people who came from France to the United States. And as I said, Auld did not necessarily take the path that we've counted here in this story, but Burrell and Poroy definitely did. These are two people who lived the experience instead of just listening to it or reading it or researching it. And it really gives credit to their name that they were able to come that whole way, get here to this roughly brand new state, and establish a farm, establish a family, establish a community, and a community that has withstood the test of time and is still here today. So thank you all for listening to this. We're going to try to do 2 more of these to cover roughly all of French Valley history. Again, there is a lot that I have not covered in this presentation and hope to in the future. So we hope to see you back. Thank you all for listening.